Dosia, who plays for Hellraisers now, is not just one of the best CSGO players of all time. He's actually by far the best Russian Counter-Strike player of all time across any version of the game. He's definitely, in CSGO terms, he'd be in my top 10 of all time individual players from any country. And he's actually played a more significant role in the history of CSGO than perhaps newer fans might realize. Because if they've only seen him in Hellraisers now, this year, and well, I haven't played this year, but just in the last 6 months or so, they'll think, okay, he's a good player. He has good games sometimes. He's in like a decent team, like a sort of 7th to 10th level team for the last 9 months or so. Yeah, okay, nothing really to write home about there. But actually, first of all, not only was he a member of the Virtus.pro lineup, which was the first team to actually unseat NiP on LAN, when NiP was 87-0 in a row, maps won on LAN, hadn't lost at all. His team was the one that came along and beat them. But even more so than that, they were the only true rival in the early days to NIP. Now, not overall. In terms of placings and winning tournaments, yes, Very Games were the rival. But in terms of rival, as in when they played NiP, you could really expect that actually Dosia teams could win, and did win. This is the matchup you want to see. Out of the first 5 best-of-3 series that NIP lost on LAN, 4 of the 5 were against teams that featured Dosia. And he was the star player of all those teams. Now, this shows you kind of the magnitude that he had in early CSGO. Because actually, in sort of the first, let's say about the first 9 months to a year of CSGO, he was a top 5 player in the world. He was very, very good. Even at the time when obviously NiP had Get Right and they had Forest, and then they had other players who were doing very well, Dosia was just below their level. Yes, Get Right and Forest were ahead of everyone. And then you had like sort of Dosia, Kenny S, Shocks. These were like the next group, Guardian. That was like the next group of players. That's how good Dosia was back then. He was an all-star MVP caliber player. But he has a history in 1.6 as well. So you go back in time to 1.6. Back in like 2008, he was playing with TPU Sports, and this was a team that most famously featured Fox, which is his brother, who'd go on to play them later in CSGO and Virtus.pro. He had Edic with him, who was his in-game leader, at least in the latter days he was. He had Overdrive, who was like just an okay player, but he was famous for, people said like he had something to do with funding some of these teams, or something along those lines. A good player who actually was in that team at the time was a guy, Doba. He was one of the better players they had, actually. In 2008, this team just came along and they established themselves as like good but not a great CIS team from Commonwealth of Independent States or whatever it's called, like Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, these countries, Eastern European basically. In this area, they were like a solid team. Now, all the ACES tournaments, which used to be 4 of in a year for the seasons, they finished 4th at 3 of them. They were pretty good. 2009 comes along. Now, in 2009, the team starts to gradually get a bit better until actually they take in Hell1, this player who used to be in Virtus.pro, who was known as a very skilled player, famous for his AK actually. They bring this player in, and that's just enough to boost them over the top. Now they win the ACES Autumn Tournament. They're the best in the CIS region in theory. They qualify for the World Cyber Games. At the World Cyber Games, where they had to use Finn, F_1N, who was also, because actually I forget who couldn't play in that tournament at the time. I forget anyway, but they had to use him as a stand-in. He was a former Virtus.pro player, but he was more of a supportive player. And actually, amazingly, they managed to finish 4th here. They almost won a medal. In the semi-final, they played again, who was actually the Poles, Neo Taz, who went on to win the tournament in dramatic fashion over Fnatic in the final. And they managed to take the Poles to 3 maps, actually. They won the second map, which was Inferno, but overall they lost. It wasn't like super close, but it was reasonably close. They gave them a good competition there. They finished 4th there. Going into 2010, now the team's name changes to Forza, and at a certain point in time, they managed to get in Romshka and they managed to get in Zek. Romshka was not thought of as a top prospect at the time, a skilled player within the region. He played in Virtus.pro in the past. They had this sick little run early on in 2010. 2010 was the year Na'Vi became the gods, remember? Well, they had this run in the CIS tournaments where they were finishing 2nd, 3rd, 2nd. They were repeatedly getting good results. They even had a game where they actually beat Na'Vi on Dust 2 at Outlet Cup CIS. The problem was, at the international tournaments, they only played a couple of any significance, and they didn't do well there. Like, they made it to the top 8 of Arbalete Cup Europe, which was decent. That was a stacked tournament. World Cyber Games, they only managed to make it to the playoffs, and there was some sort of, like, visa issues or something. I forget the exact storyline there, but they got smashed by the Koreans. We made Fox there, first round of the playoffs, so that didn't even matter. 2011, now it starts to get a bit more interesting because, okay, their level's starting to rise a little bit. They managed to make it to the top 6 of the IEM 5 European Championship. They won ACES Winter. IM World Championship, they didn't do well again. The problem here, as you're seeing the pattern here, is domestically they're fucking on fire. They're awesome. When they play against other teams who have a similar style as them, Dosia's teams, he's an extremely skilled player. He's the best player in the region. Well, no, actually, obviously Markov was the best at the time. But he's like one of the top 3 or 4 in the region at the time. His teams, when they play that style, it goes fine. But domestically, it doesn't work as well. That's something I'll get to later in terms of his style and the styles of his teams. Because the Russian style in general didn't work in international Counter-Strike. So international tournaments, you're not going to see many big results here, because when they're playing against those top Scandinavian teams over and over, they're not going to win those series. You might win a map, you might win a half, you're not going to win the map, the series rather. So IM World Championship, that didn't go well. Then there was this string of tournaments where actually their team's level was really good. It's just that unfortunately they kept running into exactly the wrong sort of opponent for them. So they had Copenhagen Games where they finished top 8. They had ICSC Intel Super Challenge Cup or whatever it was called, 8, second again, second rather, and then ESWC they finished 5th to 8th. Now these 3 results here, all 3 times they lose best of 3 series to SK Gaming, which was Forest, it was Get Right, Face, Roban, and then except for the Copenhagen Games on Delpan. Now the problem with this is, first of all, the SK team were super aimers. Like nearly all these players at one point have been star aimers and were very skilled aimers. Second, so they could match this team that I can't remember what it's called. And it went on to be called Moscow 5. I think it might have been already at this point in time. So they could match them aim-wise, so they can't outshoot them, which is what a lot of the Russian teams tried to do. And then on top of that, very lockdown CT side with good communication is what SK was. So that nullifies some of the aggressive AK play that we think of from the Russians and the pick-off warping style. And then after all of that, tactically, even though SK weren't known as the best, they still had better tactics than the Moscow Fight. So M5 just kept running into the wrong sort of team. If they'd have played Navi, it could have been close sometimes. If they'd have played the Poles, they would have been able to beat them every now and then maybe. This was the wrong sort of team for them to have to play with. So they finished second to SK in all these times that they played them in those best of X. That's a better way to describe it. Whatever. At the end of the year, they actually managed to amazingly win like sort of an international tournament. They had this MSI Beat It tournament in Russia, and Navi was there, the Poles were there, Fnatic was there. Luckily for them, the Poles took care of Navi. Fnatic took care of Navi. That's the wrong way around. Fnatic took care of the Poles, and then M5 beat Fnatic in the finals. They were able to win that. They go to the World Cyber Games this year. They managed to get the bronze this year, but that was not a year to speak about. The only really good teams there was the Poles and SK, and they can finish first and second. So, okay, nothing really to write home about. They lost to the Poles in the semi-finals. Good result on paper, but not spectacular overall. 2012 actually was when their level was getting good, because here, at this point in time, it looked like they'd cracked something, because after all those times and never having the big placing in the big tournament, IM6 Kiev, they managed to finish 3rd place, actually. They managed to beat Fnatic in the 3rd place game. This was a big result, but then at the World Championship again, just make top 6. They couldn't win, just top 6 again. Now, going beyond this, CSGO comes around. I'll talk about the style of the team later. I think I'll save that afterwards. CSGO, let's not talk about the history here. So in the early days of CSGO, you knew these were good players on the Virtus.pro lineup, but you didn't necessarily have any hint that they'd become the team to unseat NiP. Like at the first Star Ladder tournament they played at Season 4, they actually lost to the Poles, ESC, who'd only just come into the game. So you thought, okay. Tech Labs Cup early on, they played NiP in the final, they lost there. Copenhagen Games, again, you have to face NiP at some point in time in the tournament. They finished 3rd overall. That's pretty good. That's where you saw that, like, okay, there's a bit of promise here. Like they're an elite level team, but it didn't look like they'd be able to get ahead of a Very Games or an NIP at the time. Then came that moment. It was in April of 2013, as far as I remember, and NIP went to Star Ladder Season 5 Star Series Finals, and in the upper bracket final, Virtus.pro, Dosia's team, meets NIP, and they beat NIP, who hadn't lost a map ever on LAN, 87-0. They beat them 2-0 in really close games. NIP comes through the lower bracket, meets them in the final for the rematch. NIP's surely going to take it back, like correct things. No, 2-0 again. Different 2 maps this time. I forget if it was upper bracket. I think it was actually in the upper bracket first, where There's one game in particular on Nuke where Dosia goes ham on CT side. I think you can probably find like the POV demo if you go and look. He gets like 25 kills or something. He was just very impressive. He was like the standout player in that. When they played against Nip at that tournament, he was clearly the best player from his region, best player on his team, and he was like the MVP of that performance. And he was able to outgun and outplay people like GetRight, like Forresters, even though these were really great games too. Going beyond that, the problem was then the Virtus.pro team did miss the next couple of events, and then they changed the player. They took a Dren out, and they brought in Guardian at some point in time. Now, that ended up working out overall. DreamHack Summer, they play Nip in the semis. That's the rematch. These are awesome games, by the way. This was like a 3-map series from what I remember. It was like super close. This time, Nip manages to prevail. They go to the final. EMS won Summer. They play at this tournament, semi-finals, meet Nip again. This time they beat Nip. They get another victory over Nip and best of 3. They beat them. They had Guardian in the lineup at the time. They go to the final. Unfortunately, in the final, they have to play Very Games, and they lose to Very Games. Now, famously, this is where Very Games won the first tournament they'd won. This was the first title for Very Games, a tournament Nip was playing at. But it's because Virtus.pro took care of Nip for them, did them a favour. Because at the time, Very Games had never beaten Nip in an offline best of 3. Going beyond that, you then had DreamHack Bucharest. Now, here's what's interesting. At this point in time, Virtus.pro's changed. It's become Astana Dragons now. You had Dosia, you had Fox wasn't in the line. There was Dosia, Angel, who was also from Virtus.pro, Adren from Virtus.pro, and then you had Edward and Marklov. So you took the 2 superstars of Na'Vi and added them to some Virtus.pro players. There's a Astana Dragons super team that was going to be there. DreamHack Bucharest, they make it to the semi-finals. They play Nip. Nip beats them this time. Starladder Star Series Season 7 finals. This was the first tournament that Very Games won, beating Nip in a best of 3 offline and winning like the tournament at the same time. Okay. Nip, they managed to beat Nip in the upper bracket, in the lower bracket, and then they beat the Astana Dragons team. Astana Dragons plays Nip in the loser final, and they beat Nip. So they got Drosia's got another victory over the best team ever in offline. Then they lose to Very Games in the final. They finish second overall. ESWC, they lost to Clan Mystic on the other side of the bracket, and they beat Nip in the 3rd place game, but it's a 3rd place game. Who really cares about those? I'm not really sure Nip was even that into it. But again, another victory over Nip. All these victories over Nip. That'd be like 5 best of 3 offline victories over Nip in 1 year at that point in time. DreamHack Winter, the first major, comes along. And by this point in time, because of this rating and all these wins, Astana Dragons is considered like the 3rd best team in the world after Very Games, after Nip. But at this tournament, they make it to the round of 8, and they lose in 3 maps to Complexity. Nothing, Sean Gares, Swag. Those guys managed to upset them here and managed to take them out in the round of 8. So the first major, they've been a bit disappointing. And that's like a storyline that would then continue onwards. We never saw them at that elite level again where they really were going to win the tournament. They would always, after this, become this inconsistent team. One of my first videos was about this, where they would beat the big team on like one key map, but then they'd lose to a lesser team afterwards. So they were so maddeningly frustrating in that sense. So going into... one last tournament I forgot to mention, actually. One of the signs that they were dropping off was at the end of the year, there was the last Starladder tournament. And this was the one where none of the big teams went, basically, as in like Very Games, Nip and all. Those teams didn't go. And yet at this tournament, Astana Dragons and Dosia finish in last place behind that fucking game pub lineup that was like Nicolino and like a million people from different countries. That's like a sign that they could really be... Suddenly, they weren't even just elite anymore. They could just have a really buff tournament. And you could see this going into 2014. They had barely any tournaments in 2014, by the way, like internationals. They made it EMS 1 Katowice, the first major. They managed to beat Titan, managed to get out the group. Titan was the best team in the world at the time. In the round of 8, they play Dignitas, who in theory were a worse team than Titan, and they get convincingly smashed in the best of 3, and they go up 5th to 8th again. Now they skip all the tournaments now until DreamHack Summer. At DreamHack Summer, I think it was June, late June. Here, they managed to get to the semi-final, and they play Nip, and they play them really closely. They managed to win a map off Nip, and it's a great series, but they lose out. They lose to Nip here. Nip goes on to win the tournament. Skip more tournaments. Oh no, there's a tournament like not that long after, a couple of months after. DreamHack Valencia. Now this tournament didn't have elite level talent there. The best team there on paper was LDLC, the ones who'd finished... Oh no, that's wrong actually. They would finish after that semi-finals of... ELSL 1 Cologne. At this tournament, on paper, it should have been Hellraisers to take based on the DreamHack Summer result. So you had Shocks Epsilon, you had LDLC with Happy, Kaylee, those guys, Apex. and you had Hellraisers. Now, at this tournament, Hellraisers managed to finish third out of those three, and famously, Shocks went Shocksalon and just bodied them 16-0 with that like 30-3 or whatever performance on, I think it was Dust 2 actually. I think he just smashed them completely. That was the one where he just shut them down, and yet he then lost to the LDLC. So that was already a sign that like actually Hellraisers, they're just not going to be an elite level team anymore. Those days are gone. That's like almost a year past at this point in time. So you go to the next major, ESL1 Cologne. This one's where they actually went out in the group stage. This was actually really disappointing. I think they were in the same group as NIP and I think Epsilon actually again. I think they were in the NIP Epsilon group from what I remember. They go out there. Star Series number 10, because remember they're a Russian team. They always play the CIS tournaments. Star Series 10, which was the one where... Let me think. This was the one where it was Fnatic and Na'Vi, I believe, were the two teams who placed ahead of them, and they finished third overall. So even Na'Vi's overtaken them within their region, and already technically had anyway, in a way, because of the places at DreamHack Summer and the previous Star Ladder. DreamHack Winter. You see how few tournaments they played in 2014? DreamHack Winter, the last major. They make a top 8 again, 5th to 8th. They've never been to the semis or beyond in a major. This time, they managed to beat Fnatic 16-14 on Mirage in the group stage. A map Fnatic's brilliant at. Okay, really great. We all know about Blade had come in. We're all thinking, okay, they've got a chance now. They get drawn against NIP in the round of 8, and NIP had actually done quite poorly in their groups. So it's like, oh, wow, they actually might be able to get to the semis here. They might beat NIP here. Forest goes God mode. It all gets shut down. They don't look anything like the team who'd been doing so great in the group stage, and they go out 5th to 8th. Now, let's talk a bit about Dosia as a player. First of all, in 1.6, he shared nearly all the qualities he shares in CSGO. The difference is, some of the differences in CSGO make it more effective, okay? So in 1.6, he had Unreal pistols. His spray was very good. You can't be as good at spraying in CSGO, so it's not as primary a quality. His bursting especially, like those first 3 to 4 bullets he would just fire out, he had that like snap precision aim. It's not like precision aim like he tracks and then kills you the first bullet. It's like he would just snap onto you with the AK, like snap kill, and he was just sick at this. And his same with like his spray, he would like snap the spray on someone, snap it on the next guy, kill that guy. His accuracy on the first bullet was absolutely insane. The precision was very, very impressive. And his pistols were nuts, all of them. Glock, Deagle was very insane, especially medium range. He was unreal with that weapon. USP, really good. He tended to spam it a lot, but he had pretty good accuracy with it. I always remember Hooch, who you might remember now, he was on this Peter team. He's a guy who famously went back to Virtus.pro, like right back in the days of like, I think like 2005 or something. This player, or 2006, Hooch has been around the Russian scene the whole time. He's seen them all the great players. I remember him once telling me, okay, yes, we had Lex, because Lex was thought of as like the godlike player from Russia. He really was skilled. He was like the best player they'd ever produced. But even as a godlike player, his teams never got that many good results, because he was like a very good player, but actually he never used to have that many ham tournaments. He'd have like a good round. His game impact wasn't as sick as his skills were, basically. He was a very well-rounded player. We always used to say, like, okay, Lex is the best. He said to me once, like, yes, Lex was really good. Yes, like, Sally was a good AWPer in Virtus.pro back in the day. Yes, Romshka's like a talent now in the day. The difference is these are all good players, but Dosia is like the player from heaven. And he said that in, like, he's trying to speak English when he's a Russian guy. That was just, like, his evocative way of saying, like, Dosia is the godlike player. And he was right. Dosia was the player who literally had the skill level to be at the level of, like, the Forest, Neo, Get Right, Real... let me think, Rui, Kogu, Zet, these sort of beast, like, godlike level players who are some of the most skilled players of all time. He really was at that level. So you come into CSGO, and actually in the early days, the first year or so of CSGO, he was this player. His pistols were still really insane. There's always been one of his best qualities, partly because his first bullet accuracy is so good. He's the guy who would just first bullet headshot like 3 people in a row, separately with the USP, well, P2000 I guess in CSGO. He would be amazing at that. He was good with all weapons. He can do AWPing if he wants. He's good with every rifle. What's funny is you'd think he's really good with the Colt. He was famously a silenced Colt player because his spray's really good with it. But actually, because his snap burst aim's so good with the AK in both versions of the game, he's very sick in that respect as well. In terms of stylistically, he's always been a very passive, slow player. I have always joked that it's like Dosia was born with his little finger pressed down like this, because most people used like the little finger when they had the WASD to do the walk key, to do shift key. He is someone who, it felt like he walked everywhere. Now, what's weird is he was a very good terrorist player. So you'd think, well, terrorists is about rushing, right? No, Dosia would be that really slow player who'd just walk into the site. But because his aim's so sick, he'd walk in, kill this guy, then walk. Basically, Dosia's whole game, even to this day, is predicated on trying to set up 1v1s over and over. Because if he sets up a 1v1, he can outskill the guy, outshoot the guy, outreact when he sees the guy, and he can get the kill. Now, this works for him. He's very, very skilled. Not so much nowadays, but historically, when he's been at his prime, he was very skilled. So this would work in general more than it would fail. But it wasn't as effective as like team play and coordinated fast rushing sometimes, or if you're in certain situations trying to take multiple opponents. Because if you go too slow, sometimes you're giving the enemy more of choices in terms of what he then does in reaction. And it makes it so that you might have to win this insane scenario where instead you could have outmaneuvered him or given him the surprise element. Dosia's not really going to do that to you. He's going to force you into that simple 1v1 if he can. He also, part of the problem of him walking so much is that he wastes this has always been a problem. He would always waste way too much time in 1vx situations. So like a 1-on-2 or a 1v3. If it's a 1v1, it's okay. He's going to find you. He's going to kill you. By the way, he goes so slow. He wants to check every corner. He wants to like take this angle here. He doesn't want to run in and have you be behind him and just shoot him in the head. He wants to be so that when you peek out, he'll see you. You'll get an aim duel and he'll try and win the aim duel. If he knows you're holding an angle that's like hard to get into, he'll just make you come out from it. Now, if you come out, he'll get a chance at it. But if you stay there or if you fuck around with him, then he might just waste the whole bomb timer and never get a chance at it. That's what's a bit bizarre about his mentality. So he would go a bit too slow on these. I mean, I've famously seen a lot of rounds where he would be in a 1v3. He would like walk the whole way. He'd kill the first guy. He'd keep walking. Time would be getting down now. So one of the two CTs would peak. One of the terrorists, let's say. One of the two terrorists would peak. He would kill the first guy, but now there's no time left to defuse the bomb, no time left to run and kill the guy and defuse the bomb, so now he'd just back off and save. Now, in that particular scenario, yes, he got the kills, but if you actually think through it logically, unless they just rush out madly, you actually had very little chance to win the round. You never forced the action. You never smoked them out in the sense of like pushing them to get them come out the site. You never gave yourself a chance in some of these situations. So it looked very bizarre. It looked like we did what is best, but actually he didn't. His game theory approach wasn't very good to the game in that sense. Also, unfortunately, added into that approach, sometimes he'll bait. In scenarios where if the two of you ran out or quickly formed a crossfire together, you could get the kills. Sometimes he'll bait the other guy and then not bait him as in trade him, like and then just get the kill there. He'll like bait him and then still just be looking for his own favourable 1v1. It's kind of unfortunately it's typical of the Russian scene in general, but he was like the worst, because he was the best player, he's also the worst example in a weird way of that. Like he never adapted to the more European style of playing, which is more based on team play and at least trading the kill or trying to play in a cohesive unit approach. He was more individualistic in that, and he was very skilled, but yeah, more like that. He would also save very frequently. He's one of the players who will just give up on a round that he thinks is, if he thinks a round is like only 30% chance of winning it, then unless the first guy ups that chance by just peeking out and giving him a free kill, it's always like he's waiting to save. Like, yeah, okay, what's the time now? I think I'm just going to save, and they'll back off and save the weapon, which is unfortunate because in his sense, his style of saving isn't that great for his teams. Because, I mean, it's not as bad in CSGO because you could do a lot of half-buys and pistol ecos, etc. But in 1.6, where you had to be quite strict, if you did a half-buy in 1.6, you had to have a very good reason for it and a plan. But the Russian and East European teams would half-buy all the time and buy deagles all the time on saves. So they would economically limit themselves. Well, then, if you're saving and you just save one gun and you're going to keep it on a player who's very passive, who's not going to take chances, who's just going to save frequently, actually, he would be giving up a lot of rounds. He would be playing economically not a good style for them, and unfortunately if he has a rifle, if even one other person can afford a rifle, the Russian style is, well, we've got two rifles, right, everyone else get deagles in 1.6, or in CSGO obviously just like get pistols or get a FAMAS or something. So unfortunately I think it played into the economic problems that the team had in general. Now then, with all that said, with the downsides there, he is still one of the greatest CSGO players ever. In the last sort of year, 9 months to a year, yeah, it's dropped off a bit. He's still good, but he's not as effective. I think he still has the potential to be a good player. Not as great as he was in the earliest CSGO, because he was up there with those great players who were above. Like, there was a certain level of average pro that they were just above. It was like there was a bigger gap there. Just as you've seen, Getright's level couldn't be as high as it was in terms of the gap between him and all the other players. He was so much better than even the other stars. In 1.6, though, yes, a very skilled player. Unfortunately, because he never had the accomplishments, partly because of some of these factors, he could never really... And the problem is that style and that economic poorness meant that they never were going to be good on certain maps like Nuke, etc. They were never that good in general on I mean, I guess they were reasonable on Inferno. It was mainly Dust 2 and Tuscan were the maps that the Russian teams were very good on, and a bit of Train if you had some good AWPing, but not in terms of T-side. So yeah, he never had the accomplishments in 1.6 to be one of the gods, to be one of the top 15, top 20 players probably. In CSGO, he's one of the top 10 players of all time. That's who Dosia is. A skilled player. I've always enjoyed watching him. In fact, actually, I'll throw this in there. In the early days of CSGO, when IP was winning everything, Khan wanted to tell me, okay, that they had like 3 or 4 of the best 5 players in the world. And I said to him, yeah, Get Right's one of the best players. Forrest's clearly one of the best players. But you can't put Exist in the top 5 players in the world. Because Dosia right now, this is way before, by the way, Virtus.pro and seated NIP. Dosia right now is better than Exist individually. Yeah, his team's not better. In terms of what's going to happen in terms of the match, yeah, NIP would probably win. But Dosia was a better player. He was individually better. He had a big game impact. One of the greatest players of CSGO history.